Ask any aerospace engineer or military analyst what they think about the F-117 Nighthawk. If they're being honest, they'll tell you something like this. It was an aircraft that violated every principle of aerodynamics, and at the same time, pulled off the greatest institutional deception the Pentagon had ever engineered. Start with the name. Just the name. In standard U.S. military designation, the letter F stands for fighter. A fighter aircraft is fast, maneuverable, built to dominate the air, to hunt, intercept, and kill enemy planes. So what was the F-117? No gun. Not a single one. No air-to-air missiles. A top speed that barely scraped subsonic. Mach 0.92. A total weapons payload of exactly 2 bombs carried internally, and 0 onboard radar. 0. The thing was completely blind in any air-to-air scenario. By every rational standard, this was a ground attack aircraft, a tactical bomber. At best, you'd call it an A for attack or a B for bomber. So why did the U.S. Air Force call a slow, blind, bomb-hauling box truck a fighter? Because they needed the best pilots in America to fly it. And the best fighter pilots in America had egos the size of small countries. Tell a Top Gun to trade his F-15 for a bomber, he'll laugh in your face and walk out the door. But tell him he's flying the next generation fighter, a classified one, and watch him lean in. That single letter, F, was a psychological trap, a precision-engineered ego stroke. But it wasn't just for the pilots. That lie was also aimed directly at Soviet intelligence, and that's where the number 117 becomes something else entirely. Here is one of the darkest jokes in Cold War history. The stealth technology that gave the United States total air dominance came from the Soviet Union. Go back to 1962, Moscow. A Soviet physicist and mathematician named Pyotr Ufimtsev publishes a paper. The title is dry enough to put anyone to sleep. Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. Inside that paper, Ufimtsev proved, mathematically, that radar reflection has nothing to do with how large an object is. It depends entirely on the geometry of its edges and surfaces. Soviet officials read it, shrugged, and decided it was purely academic, too theoretical to matter. So they let it be published. They let it be translated. That was a fatal mistake. Years later, a radar specialist named Dennis Overholzer, working inside Lockheed's ultra-classified Skunk Works division, got hold of a translated copy. He brought in a mathematician named Bill Schroeder. Together, they recognized immediately what they were looking at. This was the blueprint for invisibility. Working from Ufimtsev's equations, they built a computer program called Echo 1, designed to calculate how much radar signal any given shape would scatter. But here's where the hardware became the enemy. 1970s supercomputers could not handle smooth, curved surfaces. Echo 1 could only calculate flat, two-dimensional panels, independent facets. So the design that came out of it looked like nothing that had ever flown. Sharp angles, flat facets bolted together at hard geometric edges. It looked less like an aircraft and more like someone had designed a fighter jet in Microsoft Paint. When the legendary Kelly Johnson, the man who designed the SR-71 Blackbird, laid eyes on this thing, he didn't hold back. He told his successor, Ben Rich, to his face, "That D-21 drone we mothballed has a smaller radar cross-section than that godforsaken diamond." The Hopeless Diamond. That was its name, a term of ridicule, a shape so aerodynamically irrational it seemed designed to fall, not fly. Then they took a wooden scale model, 7 feet long,
out to an open-air radar test range in the Mojave Desert. They pointed the radar at it, swept back and forth. The screen stayed dark. Then a radar operator suddenly called out, "I've got a contact!" Everyone looked out at the test stand. A crow had landed on the model. The radar was picking up the bird, not the aircraft. A metal airframe the size of a fighter jet had a smaller radar signature than a crow. Every objection died in that moment. In 1976, DARPA greenlit the prototype program, codenamed Have Blue. And here's where the Pentagon's appetite for creative austerity shows itself. They had two prototypes to build, two revolutionary, physics-defying aircraft that would reshape air warfare forever. The budget? $35 million. So Lockheed did what any genius does when given no money and no time. They went scrounging. The fly-by-wire control system, borrowed from the F-16. Landing gear, pulled off an A-10 Warthog. Engines, J-85 turbojets stripped from the T-38 trainer. Ejection seat and cockpit instruments taken from the F-5. The first stealth aircraft in human history was, technically speaking, a patchwork of hand-me-downs. But strapping that patchwork together and forcing it into the sky, that's where the nightmare began. The aerodynamic nightmare that killed men and triggered cover-ups the Pentagon buried for decades.
Before we get to what this aircraft could do to its enemies, let's talk about what it did to its own people. The F-117 did not fly. Not naturally. Not in any physical sense that a pilot would recognize. Look at the design. No horizontal tail. A delta wing built entirely from flat, angular panels. The result was a machine that was completely unstable on all three axes, pitch, roll, and yaw, simultaneously. Test pilots called it the Wobblin Goblin, and not affectionately. It stayed airborne only because of a quadruple redundant fly-by-wire computer system, borrowed, remember, from the F-16. 4 computers arguing with each other thousands of times per second, making micro-corrections to the control surfaces, physically forcing the aircraft to remain in the air. If all 4 computers failed at once, you had one option: pull the ejection handle, because the plane would drop like a thrown brick. Now, July 11th, 1986, pre-dawn, Tonopah Test Range, Nevada. Major Ross Mulhare, experienced, decorated, takes off in an F-117 for a routine night training flight. The aircraft always flew at night to stay invisible from Soviet satellites and civilian eyes. That night, something went wrong. Spatial disorientation, fatigue, the Goblin's notorious instability. Whatever the cause, Mulhare's aircraft nosed over. In the dark, in the desert, he had no horizon to correct against. The F-117 hit a ridgeline in the Sequoia National Forest at full speed. The crash investigator who arrived on scene said it was, without exception, the worst aircraft wreck he had ever seen. The impact was so violent it ignited a 150-acre wildfire. For the families of pilots, this was a tragedy. For the Pentagon, this was a national security emergency. Scattered across 150 acres of burning forest were fragments of radar-absorbent material, faceted panels with a geometry unlike anything publicly acknowledged, components that, if picked up by the right person, a journalist, a curious hiker, a KGB operative, would expose one of the most classified weapons programs in American history. Local firefighters were trying to get in. Media had already smelled smoke. The response was immediate and total. Armed helicopters circled overhead. Ground troops established a hard perimeter. Nobody in, not firefighters, not press, not local law enforcement. Then came the cleanup. A 1,000-foot sweep radius from the outermost recognizable debris fragment. Every inch of soil within that radius was excavated, sifted. Controlled explosives were used to collapse sections of hillside and extract components buried on impact. But you can't leave a scorched mountain with nothing on it. The media would come, and when they found nothing, they'd start asking questions that were worse than the crash itself. So the Pentagon did something extraordinary. At Area 51, in the Boneyard, sat a decommissioned F-101 Voodoo fighter jet, retired in 1972, 14 years sitting in the desert sun. They pulled it out, destroyed it deliberately, loaded the wreckage onto trucks, drove it to the Sequoia crash site, and scattered the pieces across the ground they had just cleaned. 3 weeks later, the cordon lifted. A camera crew from KERO-TV in Bakersfield chartered a helicopter and flew straight to the site. They found debris everywhere, around a makeshift landing pad, spread across the hillside. They filled 3 large bags with metal fragments, went home, ran a triumphant segment on the Friday evening news, then dutifully handed the bags over to an Air Force public affairs officer. The Air Force spokesman accepted the bags, thanked them, said the fragments would be examined as a precaution, noted that the wreckage appeared to be from a routine experimental aircraft. The story died. The KGB saw nothing alarming. The public moved on. America's most advanced weapons program continued flying in the dark, protected by the bones of a 14-year-old jet no one had thought about since Nixon was in office. There's a story from the 1991 Gulf War that almost nobody tells. When F-117 squadrons deployed to Saudi Arabia for Operation Desert Storm, the ground crews started finding something strange every morning. Dead bats. Scattered around the tail sections of the aircraft every morning without fail. It took the scientists a while to figure it out. Bats navigate by echolocation. They emit ultrasonic pulses and read the echoes back. The faceted design of the F-117 didn't just scatter radar waves, it scattered sound waves in the same way. The aircraft was acoustically invisible. Automatic cameras with ultrasonic autofocus, a technology common at the time, literally could not focus on the Nighthawk. It registered as nothing. For the bats, flying in the dark, emitting pulses in every direction, the F-117 simply didn't exist. They flew straight into the tail section at full speed. A beautiful story, almost poetic, a testament to how completely the engineering had succeeded. But the cost of that success, the real cost, didn't show up in a press release. The stealth capability of the F-117 depended as much on its surface coating as on its shape. A radar-absorbent material, RAM, applied across every inch of the airframe, and that material was chemically catastrophic. June 27, 1991. Lockheed is preparing to move an early F-117 prototype, tail number 781, nicknamed Scorpion 2, to a museum. To declassify it safely, the entire RAM coating has to be stripped. The coating had bonded to the airframe with extraordinary adhesion. The only way to remove it was high-pressure sodium bicarbonate blasting, essentially sand blasting with baking soda at industrial pressure.
The process created dense clouds of fine particulate matter that penetrated every seam, every recess of the aircraft. Workers wore full hazmat suits, taped every gap. They were handling something the Air Force wouldn't formally characterize to them. The maintenance crew, exhausted, overheated, furious at conditions they hadn't been warned about, grabbed spray paint. On the side of the aircraft, they painted a skull and crossbones. Below it, in large letters, "Toxic Death." Near the canopy, a second message, "Ray who?" A jab at a project supervisor they despised. That wasn't graffiti. That was testimony, written by the people who built the thing. But the maintenance crew stripping Plane 781 at least had hazmat suits. The workers who built and maintained Area 51, Groom Lake, through the 1980s didn't. The classified waste generated by the F-117 program, spent ram coating, composite materials, chemical solvents, was disposed of in open pit burns. They dug pits the size of football fields, poured in 55-gallon drums of unidentified chemicals, soaked everything in jet fuel, lit it. The smoke drifted across the base. Carpenters, sheet metal workers, technicians breathed it for years. The results were not ambiguous. Bleeding skin lesions, respiratory damage, rare cancers. A sheet metal worker named Robert Frost, known as Frosty, died in 1990, severe liver disease. He had spent years working in the burn smoke. His widow, Helen Frost, joined with other affected workers and sued the U.S. government and the Air Force. Their request was simple. Tell us what chemicals were in those pits so our doctors know what they're treating. The response from the Department of Defense was a legal maneuver so cold it almost reads as satire. They invoked the state secrets privilege. Their argument in court was this: we cannot disclose the chemical composition of the pit burn waste because doing so might reveal the formula of the F-117's radar absorbent coating, and that is classified. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed. It ruled the privilege was, in this case, absolute. The Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal. The case was closed. The workers received nothing. The F-117 was designed to be invisible to radar, and somehow the men who built it became invisible to the law.
If you want to understand what an F-117 is aerodynamically, try this. Take a fighter jet, any conventional fighter, and remove every feature that makes it flyable. No horizontal stabilizer, razor-edged delta wings with faceted panels instead of smooth surfaces. A center of gravity so far forward of the neutral point that the aircraft is inherently, violently unstable. Now ask someone to fly it in front of 12,000 civilians at an air show. September 14th, 1997, Chesapeake, Maryland, the Bay Bridge Air Expo. Major Brian Knight, experienced instructor pilot, was making his third flyby pass in F-117 tail number 81-793. Altitude, 600 to 700 feet. Speed, 380 knots, roughly 437 miles per hour. On that third pass, with no warning,
The aircraft began shaking. In less than 1 second, the left wing of the Nighthawk tore free from the fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted. The deceleration from asymmetric lift collapse created G-forces that slammed Knight's head into the instrument panel. By instinct, and with roughly 5 seconds of consciousness remaining, he found the ejection handle and pulled. The aircraft, still carrying 11,000 pounds of fuel, hit a residential neighborhood and exploded. A house was destroyed. Several civilians were injured. Somehow, no one died. The investigation that followed uncovered something that made the entire Air Force stop cold. The wing had failed because of 4 bolts. Inside the wing structure of the F-117 is a load-bearing I-beam assembly the maintenance crews called the Brooklyn Bridge. It transfers aerodynamic force and connects to the control surface actuators. In January 1996, a maintenance crew had removed this assembly for a scheduled overhaul. When they reinstalled it, they failed to reinstall 4 of the 39 required high-lock fasteners. The explanation given by the crew chief was that the area was tedious and difficult to access. They left it incomplete. A mandatory inspection targeting that exact section was scheduled for March 1997. It was skipped. The reason given in the paperwork? Budget constraints and contract limitations. For 18 months, an F-117 flew public demonstrations with a structurally compromised wing, 4 bolts short of airworthy, while its maintenance record quietly accumulated reasons why no one had looked. The Pentagon had spent billions of dollars, mobilized the greatest engineering minds in American history to build an aircraft that could defeat the most sophisticated air defense network in the Soviet Union. And it was brought down by boredom and budget paperwork. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. And it is worth sitting with, because it says something real about the gap between what technology can do and what human beings will actually maintain.
People look at the F-117 today and see a relic. The pixel art fighter. The plane too slow to fight, too limited to matter, too strange to respect. That reading is wrong. The F-117 was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to answer one question, the defining military aerospace question of the Cold War. Can we actually build an aircraft invisible to radar? To answer that question with 1970s computing, with the machines available, with the math available, the engineers had to sacrifice everything else. Aerodynamic stability, speed, self-defense capability, and, as we've seen, the health and legal standing of the people who built it. The aircraft was a test, a brutal, expensive, occasionally deadly test. And it passed. In Desert Storm, the F-117 flew 2% of coalition combat sorties. It struck 40% of the highest value strategic targets. It flew over Baghdad, a city defended by one of the densest integrated air defense networks ever assembled, alone, at night, without escorts, without jamming support, and placed laser-guided bombs through specific windows of specific buildings. No aircraft was lost in combat. Before the Nighthawk, military planners asked, how many aircraft does it take to destroy a target? The F-117 turned that into a different question. How many targets can one aircraft destroy? When the F-117 was retired in 2008, it wasn't because it had failed. It was because it had succeeded completely, and its successors no longer needed to carry its limitations. The B-2 Spirit, the F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning II. None of them exist without the data, the hard, painful, sometimes lethal data generated by the Wobblin' Goblin. The smooth curves of modern stealth aircraft exist because the flat-faceted, hopeless diamond proved the principle. The B-2's wing geometry is the answer to a question the F-117 asked first. The F-22's combination of speed and low observability was only imaginable because an earlier generation of engineers had already proved in the desert at night that the radar could be beaten. The F-117 Nighthawk accepted every penalty, aerodynamic, political, human, to demonstrate that a new kind of warfare was possible. It wasn't the best aircraft ever built. It was the first aircraft willing to be bad at everything except the one thing that mattered. And in the long history of weapons that changed the world, that is enough.